Timeless Assassin. By author Raj_Shah_7152. Chapter 871 to 888. Chapter 871 Arrogance. Planet Ixtal, the Skyshard family temporary shelter. Leo's paw. Ever since Ixtal had been reduced to dust under the righteous faction's purge, there were very few places left on the planet that could still be considered reliable shelter, which was why the Skyshard family, much like the rest of the survivors, had been forced into temporary housing clustered around Soren's castle, the only structure sturdy enough to anchor what little safety remained. Step. As Leo stepped inside the makeshift dwelling, the cramped interior and narrow living space struck him immediately, not with discomfort, but with a quiet sense of familiarity, as the worn walls and low ceiling reminded him of the housing colony back on Earth where he, Elena, and Luke had once lived through days that were far harsher than this. Back then, they had owned almost nothing. And yet, as children, neither he nor Luke had ever truly felt deprived, because even in those tight, unforgiving spaces, there had been warmth, shared meals, and the unspoken certainty that they were not facing the world alone. This brings back some memories. Leo mused softly, as he lowered himself onto the narrow bed with a small laugh, pulling Amanda along with him without ceremony, the worn mattress dipping under their combined weight while the children continued to race around the tiny space, their bare feet thudding against the floor as laughter bounced off the walls. For a while, Leo simply lay there, one arm tucked behind his head and the other resting loosely around Amanda's shoulders, as he watched Caleb chase Myron in uneven circles, the two of them shrieking with delight as they leapt onto the bed and scrambled off again. Completely unbothered by the cramped space or the ruin that waited beyond these walls. It was loud, chaotic, messy, and yet, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Leo felt no urge to control it. No instinct to impose order, no need to silence the noise, as the sound of their laughter settled into his chest in a way that felt more comforting than any victory he had ever claimed. Shift. Amanda shifted slightly beside him, her head resting against his shoulder as she watched the same scene with a softness in her eyes that Leo rarely saw directed outward anymore, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing slow circles against his chest. After a while, she spoke. "Are you planning on meeting Soren today? Or are we going to enjoy a couple days of quiet before you do?" She asked quietly, not pressing, not demanding, as if she already knew the answer but wanted to hear it from him all the same. Leo did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned his head just enough to watch Caleb launch himself onto the bed again, only to bounce off and collapse into giggles, while Myron followed a heartbeat later, less confident but no less eager, the two of them rolling together in an uncoordinated tangle of limbs. A faint smile tugged at Leo's lips. "Soon," he said at last, his voice low and unhurried, as he reached out and caught Myron mid-jump, lifting him effortlessly before setting him back down beside Caleb. "But first, let me enjoy this for a moment." Amanda looked up at him then, really looked, and something in her expression softened even further. Leo exhaled slowly as he watched the children scramble over the bed again, their joy absolute and uncomplicated, as the universe outside faded into something distant and unimportant, and for this one fragile stretch of time, he allowed himself to simply be here. Not as the shadow dragon. Not as a conqueror. Not as a symbol. But just as a father lying on a too small bed, surrounded by laughter, as his children jumped around him without a care in the universe. Meanwhile, back at the Universal Government Administrative Department, the report was compiled without ceremony, as most reports of this nature always were, its language precise, restrained, and deliberately stripped of emotion, even as the implications beneath its clean formatting carried far more weight than the words themselves ever would. Subject: Cult Asset Status Review. Designation: Third Elder. Classification: Deep Cover Operative. Status: Non-responsive. It detailed the timeline methodically, as the last confirmed transmission from the Third Elder was logged several days prior, followed by a succession of failed contact attempts conducted through layered channels, astral relays, and emergency fallback signals, each one returning the same result: silence. No confirmation pings. No encoded distress responses. No signs of interception that could be verified. The analysts who assembled the report avoided speculation, as protocol demanded, yet the conclusion was inevitable, and so it was written plainly near the bottom of the page. Assessment: Given the duration of non-response and the absence of retrievable signal residue, Asset Third Elder is to be presumed neutralized until further notice. The report was finalized, encrypted, and transmitted upward within minutes, its arrival marked by a subtle chime inside a private office buried deep within the administrative spire, far removed from public chambers and ceremonial halls. A senior official sat behind a broad wooden desk as the data scrolled before him, his fingers steepled beneath his chin while his eyes moved steadily from line to line, as though committing each detail to memory rather than reacting to it. When he reached the final assessment, he exhaled slowly. The loss of a top asset right before a big event is never a good sign. He muttered, as his gaze drifted toward the towering window behind his desk, where the distant glow of the city pulsed behind him. He tapped the edge of the desk once, thoughtfully, as his mind moved several steps ahead, connecting threads that had not yet been spoken. Aloud, the neutralization of the Third Elder at such a critical time could hint that the cult might be onto their plans already. And yet, he continued softly, as a thin, humorless smile touched his lips, it is already too late for them to change anything, even if they somehow manage to catch and interrogate the Third Elder. He said as he straightened slightly, his expression settling back into professional indifference, as if the loss of a life, even a deeply embedded one, was no more than an inconvenient variable for the righteous faction whose victory in this war was all but guaranteed. Chapter 872 The Long-Awaited Meeting. Planet Ixtal, Soren's Castle. Leo approached Soren's castle with measured, restrained steps, his pace slower than it needed to be as his gaze lingered on the ancient wooden doors looming before him, their surface darkened by age and weather, as he found himself wondering whether he should knock and wait like a guest seeking permission, or simply push them open and step inside as he felt was appropriate for the vice-sect master of the cult. What should I do? He wondered, as for a brief moment, he stopped to consider both options. As the cult's number 2 man, I shouldn't need to wait to see the sect master, however, if there's anyone in this universe who deserves my genuine reverence and respect, it's Soren. So out of respect for his seniority, I should probably wait. Leo thought, as after a few seconds of quiet deliberation, he exhaled softly and chose restraint, as he lifted his fist with the intention of knocking rather than forcing his way through. However, before his fists could ever hit the doors creaked open on their own, heavy wood parting without resistance as though anticipating his arrival, while a presence pressed outward from within, vast and unmistakable. Come in, Shadow Dragon. Soren's voice echoed from deeper inside the castle, calm yet layered with authority, as he addressed Leo by his official title rather than his name. Leo paused for half a heartbeat, then smiled faintly, as lowering his hand, he stepped forward into the castle, the doors closing behind him with a dull thud as the familiar scent of wet stone, copper, and medicinal herbs filled his senses, reminding him of the few times he had visited this castle with Charles before. Step, step, step. As he stepped in deeper, he could sense the lingering presence of death in the air, as the atmosphere shifted subtly around him, the warmth of the brazier failing to mask the underlying stench of decay, as though something fundamental had withered here long ago and never truly left, its rot seeping into the very breath of the room. Sniff. It was not the smell of blood, nor the sharpness of recent death. It was older than that. Stagnant, exhausted, final. Leo's jaw tightened slightly as he continued forward, his senses sharpening despite himself, as every instinct he possessed screamed that this was a place where life was being stubbornly defied rather than sustained, as if Soren's body itself had become a battlefield between what should have already ended and what refused to yield. Step, step. As Leo entered the tea room, Soren noticed the worry on his face instantly, as his lips curved faintly, not quite as a smile, but as an acknowledgement of Leo's concern, as his pale fingers lifted the teapot from the low table with measured care, the motion precise yet strained, as though even something as simple as pouring required deliberate control of his muscles now. Sit, Soren instructed calmly, as he gestured toward the stone seat opposite him, his voice steady despite the faint rasp beneath it. No need to stand so tensely. I am not going to collapse just yet, he assured, as Leo did not reply immediately. Instead, he moved as instructed, lowering himself onto the seat across from Soren, his posture straight, controlled, respectful, as his eyes never left the ancient god's face, as he took in every hollowed contour and subtle tremor that Soren clearly believed he was hiding well enough. *TSS's. Steam curled upward as Soren poured the tea, the liquid a deep amber laced with crushed leaves and faint glowing motes, as he set one cup before Leo before pouring another for himself, his hand pausing for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. As it was that mere pause that told Leo everything he needed to know. Soren was not healthy, and his body had stopped obeying him like it ideally should. "I have been waiting for you for a long time now," Soren said, as he lifted his own cup, his fingers tightening around the porcelain slightly, as though holding it looser would make him lose his grip. Slurp. Drinking sounds. For a moment, neither spoke. God and Shadow Dragon. Overlord and successor. The duo simply studied one another, as Leo realized with quiet certainty that the man before him was already standing with one foot firmly beyond the threshold of life, while Soren studied just how big of a monster Leo had become since the last time he had seen him. "Your aura, it's greener than the greenest shade I've ever seen in my life. You're clinging onto life through sheer will alone. Else you could have passed away yesterday," Leo observed, as he looked at Soren's form and the clinging green aura around his body in shocked amazement. He knew very well from experience, just how hard it was for a man to conjure green around their body, which was why he understood exactly how much Soren was suffering just to remain breathing at this moment, considering how his green aura covered the entire tea room at this moment. "You're not wrong, Skyshard, I really am at my limits now. Which means, this next war is going to be my last one. I have already accepted my fate. I have nothing left to lose anymore, and I will fight like a man with nothing left to lose. My death is certain, and hence I will try to take as many gods as possible with me to the afterlife," Soren declared, as Leo listened to his words in calm contemplation before letting out a deep sigh. After witnessing Soren's condition firsthand, he understood exactly how difficult it was for Soren to even breathe and move in his current state, which was why he did not expect the great god to survive the next big war either. However, what he did not want was for Soren to fall publicly before the entire universe. Not only was he the symbol of the cult's pride and defiance throughout all the cult's tumultuous history, but he was also the one being whose anger was the only deterrence that kept the righteous faction from eliminating every cultist alive. And hence, for the sake of future peace and long-term stability, it was important that Soren's death never occurred in a public format. "I understand your position, old man. I really do. However, I'm afraid I can't allow you to die just yet. Not publicly at least. For here is what I intend to do," Leo began, as with a confident look on his face, started to explain his real plan to win this upcoming war and save their Chapter 873, A Dangerous Plan. "I understand your position, old man. I really do. However, I can't allow you to die just yet. Not publicly, at least. Because here is what I intend to do," Leo began, his expression steady and unflinching, as he laid out his true plan piece by piece, explaining how he intended to win the coming war and pull Ver back from the edge of extinction. For a long while, Soren listened in silence, his expression shifting repeatedly from disbelief to intrigue to disbelief once more, as he weighed every implication and failure point in Leo's proposal, because while the plan itself was undeniably brilliant if every condition aligned exactly as Leo envisioned, it was also frighteningly fragile the moment even a single variable slipped out of place. "It's extremely risky," Soren finally said, his voice low and heavy. "If you're wrong, if either you or I fail the cult, then this truly will be the end." He paused, a faint tremor running through his shoulders as a thin sheen of sweat rolled down his temple, the strain of remaining upright for nearly an hour finally catching up to him. "With this plan, we wager everything, all that remains of us, on saving Ver." "It is risky," Leo admitted without hesitation, his jaw tightening as he met Soren's gaze directly. "But tell me, realistically, what other choice do we have?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice sharpening. "I'm flattered that you believe I can take over the cult once you're gone, but the truth is that I'm still only a monarch-tier warrior, and not you." His fists clenched slowly at his sides. "If the righteous faction's gods decide they want me dead, then I'll be no different from an unarmed child standing in front of a veteran executioner." He exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. "The truth is simple. We don't have another path." His eyes hardened. "Either we make our final stand with you, our only god, while your presence still terrifies the universe, or we don't make a stand at all, and the cult fades quietly into history as nothing more than a failed rebellion. Footnote. Leo fell silent then, but the weight of his words lingered heavily in the room. Deep down, he already knew the answer. The cult had no choice but to stake everything on this single war. The conditions were far from ideal. The odds were stacked mercilessly against them. And yet, if they somehow pulled off this impossible victory, it would give the cult something it had never truly possessed before. A foundation. One strong enough to endure for the next 500 years, allowing them to remain a dominant force in the universe even after Soren's death. Huff. Soren exhaled sharply as he leaned back into his chair, the old wood creaking softly beneath his weight as Leo's words continued to pulse through his mind, echoing again and again while he turned the plan over from multiple angles, probing not for optimism, but for the exact point where it would most likely collapse. "The biggest flaw I see in your plan," Soren said slowly, his voice heavy with certainty, "is that we would be walking straight into an ambush." He lifted his gaze, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion weighing on his body. "It's brave of you to assume that we can walk back out alive. However, if the enemy has prepared the Chakravya formation to greet us, which I very much assume they will, then there will be no escape once we step inside it." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "We can enter. Yes. But we cannot leave." His eyes narrowed. "That is the nature of the Chakravya. Once you reach its center, you are already doomed." The implication hung heavily in the air, because Leo knew exactly what Soren was referring to, the same formation that had once claimed the life of Soren's father, the greatest warrior to ever walk the face of the universe, a man whose strength had shaken epics and yet had still been swallowed whole by that merciless design. Sigh. Leo let out a deep breath of his own and shrugged his shoulders slightly, neither defensive nor dismissive, as he acknowledged the truth in Soren's words without trying to soften it. He knew it. He had known it from the start. He did not truly understand just how monstrous the Chakravya was, nor whether the cult could realistically pull off something this insane. But those were questions that only Soren, with his lived experience and scars, could properly weigh. As in the end, the decision was never meant to be Leo's alone. "It's your call, old man," Leo said quietly, his voice steady as he leaned back slightly. "In the end, you're still the sect master." He left it there, his gaze unwavering as Soren shook his head once in disbelief before releasing another tired breath. "The Chakravya cannot be broken from within once you step inside. It," Soren said, his voice firm. "But it can be broken from the outside." Leo's eyes sharpened. "The formation is layered," Soren continued. "At its very core stand the strongest warriors the enemy has to offer. They're gods." He lifted a finger slightly. "Let us assume that I deal with them. All of them. At once." His hand trembled faintly as it lowered again. "But that is my limit." Soren leaned forward now, locking eyes with Leo. "That means you will need to carve a single opening through everything else. Masters. Grandmasters. Transcendents. Monarchs. Even demigods." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "One opening. Just one." He held Leo's gaze without blinking. "And if you fail, then all of us die." The silence that followed was absolute. It was Soren, at last, throwing the decision back into Leo's hands. Asking him without words whether he truly understood the weight of what he was offering. Leo did not hesitate. Meeting Soren's gaze head-on, his expression calm, confident, and unyielding, he nodded once. "If you keep up your end," Leo said quietly, his voice carrying a steel that did not waver, "then I promise you this, old man." His aura stirred faintly, sharp and resolute. "Even if I'm torn apart limb by limb trying to save you, I'll still find a way to give you that opening." He held the gaze, unflinching. "That much, I swear." Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Chapter 874 The Path Ahead. The Time-Stilled World, Leo's POV. After his meeting with Soren, Leo returned to the time-stilled world feeling sure of what he needed to do to prepare for Ver's rescue, as he finally had a clear vision forming in his mind on what exactly needed to be achieved for that impossible dream to become possible, as the plan was no longer vague or theoretical, but rather sharp, structured, and brutally realistic. There was no hesitation left in him. No doubt about the path forward. As for the next 50 days, Leo trained without interruption, without indulgence, and without allowing even a single moment of complacency to take root, as he threw himself entirely into mastering space tunneling, repeating the same motions again and again while refining angles, correcting micro-deviations, and forcing his body and mind to obey precision rather than habit. He practiced opening tunnels at fixed degrees until the numbers no longer required conscious thought, as slicing at specific micro-angles became as natural as breathing to him, while distance calculations shifted from something he measured to something he felt, each tunnel forming cleaner, smoother, and more stable than the last, as mistakes became rare, then non-existent. By the end of the 50th day, Leo could open a space tunnel almost instantly, its structure stable, its membranes uniform, its slope predictable from entry to exit, allowing him to cross planetary distances without hesitation or drift, as though the fourth dimension itself had finally acknowledged his presence rather than resisting it. Yet despite that progress, a limitation remained. The tunnels he created were precise, efficient, and reliable, but only for one. They could hold him, and only him. Any attempt to widen them destabilized the structure immediately, as the membranes strained, warped, and threatened collapse under increased spatial load, making it painfully clear that while Leo could move like a blade through the fourth dimension, he could not yet carve a path wide enough for others to follow. An assassin's road, not a general's. As it was only after Leo reached this wall, after he confirmed beyond doubt that no amount of brute refinement would change this limitation, that Multheric finally chose to speak. They stood together at the edge of the floating island once more, the endless stilled ocean stretching beneath them, as Multheric watched Leo close another tunnel cleanly before letting it dissolve. "You have mastered space tunneling for an individual," Multheric said calmly, his voice heavy with something unreadable. Then he turned. "But that was never how an army crosses the fourth dimension." Leo's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked up at the ancient dragon, confusion flickering across his expression, because up until this moment he had been certain that the entire purpose of mastering space tunneling was to lead an army through it. Only gods possess an aura powerful enough to anchor and guide entire armies through the fourth dimension, Multheric said calmly. And since you are not one yet, your aura alone is not sufficient to achieve that feat. Leo frowned deeply at those words, his frustration surfacing immediately. Then what was the point of all this training? He asked, his tone sharpened by impatience as Multheric shook his head slowly, a faint note of disappointment passing through his gaze. "Did I ever say you would not be able to lead an army through it?" He replied. "No," he continued without pause. "I said your current aura is not strong enough." Leo stilled. "That is why I will store my aura for you, in special orbs," he said, as he lifted a claw slightly, and presented Leo with 3 spatial orbs. "Crush one, and you will temporarily gain the output required to open a wide, stable tunnel capable of transporting an army. However, beware, crushing one also means surviving the full might of my unbridled aura. Which won't be pretty unless you have appropriate aura shield protection." Leo's eyes widened. In an instant, everything clicked into place. This was exactly the solution he had been searching for, because, quite simply, he did not have the luxury of time to master yet another layer of space tunneling before the war arrived. "Sounds good to me," he muttered, as with that his training under Multheric officially drew to a close, allowing him to leave the floating island in favor of the upcoming war. "Do not forget our deal, boy. The promise you have made me. I did not put all these efforts into you and teach you space tunneling out of the goodness of my heart. It is an investment. An investment that I hope will give me miraculous returns in a new body," Multheric reminded as he stopped Leo before he left. "I won't fail you, old dragon, for it's either my plan works and you get a new body, or it fails and I die. So if I'm still alive, you should be pretty certain that you are getting your desired body," Leo said, as he stepped away from the edge of the floating island and let the space around him fold once more, carrying the weight of that promise with him as something solid rather than burdensome, as the implications of what lay ahead settled into his thoughts with quiet inevitability. The path forward was no longer chaotic or uncertain as it had been weeks ago, but rather frighteningly clear, mapped out by limitations, sacrifices, and points of failure he could no longer afford to ignore, as every step from this moment onward would either bring him closer to saving Ver and setting up a new unshakable foundation for the cult, or bury all of them beneath the consequences of a single miscalculation. He understood now that this war would not be won through raw strength alone, nor through miracles or desperate improvisation, but rather through precision, timing, and the willingness to stand at the center of a storm without flinching, as he would be required to carve a single opening through the finest warriors the universe had to offer while holding together a plan fragile enough to collapse under hesitation. I can do this. I have to, he thought to himself, the floating island fading behind him as he opened a spatial tunnel to Skyshard City, his mind focused on what was coming instead of what had already been survived, because there was no longer any room left for doubt, no space for regret, and no luxury of retreat. Only forward, only execution, and only one chance to turn the impossible into possible. Chapter 875 The Madman. Planet Granada, Morris's paw. Rain fell endlessly from the blackened heavens, not in sheets but in needles, each droplet striking the surface of the endless ocean below and vanishing without a trace, as lightning carved violent scars across the sky and thunder rolled in low, amused rumbles, as though the planet itself was complicit in the madness unfolding upon it. At the center of it all, upon the only stretch of land that dared rise above the sea, Morris stood barefoot and bare-chested, his pale skin slick with rain, his long hair floating unnaturally around his head as he tilted his head back, and laughed. Ha, ha ha, ha ha ha. It was not loud at first. Not explosive. Just a soft, breathy sound that slipped past his lips as rain streamed down his face, as though the sky itself was whispering a private joke only he could hear. He he he. The laughter grew, slowly, uncontrollably, until it echoed across the empty sea, bouncing off thunder and lightning alike, as Morris spread his arms wide and welcomed the storm like an old friend. Oh, I've finally decided, he murmured, his voice light, almost playful, as his eyes shimmered with unrestrained delight. I've been the hunter my entire life, savoring the chase, enjoying the thrill of cornering prey that never stood a chance. He let out a small sigh, almost wistful, as his fingers twitched. But these past few days, he continued, smiling wider, I've realized something rather fascinating. Lightning struck the ocean behind him, illuminating his expression for a split second. There's a special kind of fun in being the prey as well. He chuckled again, rain sliding down his jaw as he shook his head slowly, as though amused by his own revelation. Soren, Morris said softly, almost fondly, as if speaking to a ghost. Between you and me, I truly don't know who lived the better life. His eyes drifted toward the horizon, where storm and sea merged into an endless void. You, he went on, who spent your entire existence being hunted, waiting patiently for revenge, your hatred keeping you warm through the centuries. His smile twisted. Or me? He asked, tapping his own chest lightly. Who has been bored for so very, very long? Thunder rolled again. Morris exhaled, slow and theatrical. Eternal life is long, he said, his voice dropping. And lonely. He lowered his arms at last, rainwater dripping from his fingertips back into the sea below. If I am to live forever, he continued thoughtfully, then I must entertain myself. His eyes gleamed. And to do that, he whispered, a shiver of excitement running through him, perhaps I should make the entire universe my enemy. The silence that followed was brief. Then he laughed again, louder this time. Oh, how interesting would that be? Morris crooned, his shoulders shaking with amusement. The looks on their faces when they finally realized that the deceiver. He leaned forward slightly, rain pouring off his hair. Has deceived them. His lips parted slowly as he inhaled, savoring something only he could taste. The shock, he murmured. The anger. The hatred. He closed his eyes. Morris sighed, voice trembling with pleasure. It's already delicious. Another bolt of lightning split the sky, freezing his grin in stark white light, his expression no longer playful but utterly unhinged, as though he were standing at the edge of something vast and irreversible. Ha. He laughed, the sound tearing itself from his throat with unrestrained delight as it rolled across the storm-lashed sea, unbelievably ominous as he turned his back on the endless ocean and began walking toward the lone structure carved into the rock, rain still pouring down his bare shoulders while lightning continued to dance behind him like a mockery of divinity. Regardless of what happens to Soren, Morris murmured, his voice light and cheerful. I think I'll have a lot of fun very soon. His lips curled upward once more, not into a grin, but into something sharper, more anticipatory, as the storm swallowed his figure and the laughter lingered just a second longer than it should have, echoing unnaturally before vanishing into the thunder. The time-stilled world, Leo's POV. Huff. Huff. Asterisk. Leo stood at the center of the isolated training ground, sweat rolling down his back and soaking into the stone beneath his feet as his chest rose and fell heavily, his muscles trembling from exhaustion while his aura slowly settled back into his body like a beast finally returning to its cage. Despite the fatigue threatening to pull him to his knees, a victorious smile was carved firmly across his face. "I did it," Leo muttered, his voice hoarse yet steady, as he clenched his fists and felt the residual energy still humming through his bones. "I finally completed learning all of the cult's forbidden moves." For 2 full years, every moment that he had not spent learning how to space tunnel, had been poured into this singular obsession, as whenever he found himself with even a fragment of free time, he returned to the same technique again and again, refining it, tempering it, forcing his body and soul to adapt. It was the forbidden move he had memorized long ago from the Black Serpent Guild's vault, the one his body had been too weak to endure back then, when even attempting it was akin to inviting death. But now, as a monarch, and someone who had mastered aura, he had finally managed to master the forbidden technique and also learnt how to perform it without backlash. Splat. Leo straightened slowly, wiping the sweat from his brow as he gazed into the empty training ground around him, the time-stilled world bearing silent witness to his transformation. "With this," he said quietly, the smile on his face sharpening into something resolute and dangerous, "I feel like I am finally ready for war," he declared as he sheathed his dagger and put on his assassin cloak. End of Volume 8. The Last Stand. See you all in the next volume. A New Era of Chaos. Chapter 876. A Father's Blind Love. Timeless Assassin. Volume 9. A New Era of Chaos. Men do not wage war for land, or gods, or survival. They wage it to be seen. Peace allows too many lies to persist, too many small men to believe themselves sufficient, too many fragile hierarchies to stand untested. War strips those lies bare. It forces every soul to answer a single question it has spent a lifetime avoiding. What are you at your core, when there is nothing left to hide behind? And when the answer terrifies them, men do not change. They simply call it destiny, and march. Archivist Halden Vera, On the Nature of Conflict Volume 2. Over 2 millennia ago, the timeless assassin's paw, planet Ixtal. The timeless assassin sat in the tea room of the stone castle as he often did, one hand loosely wrapped around a porcelain cup while steam rose in slow, patient coils, the warmth settling into his fingers as he enjoyed the peace and tranquility. The room was quiet, not out of emptiness, but out of respect, its stone walls worn smooth by centuries of conversations that had reshaped the universe, as even the wind inside seemed to drift carefully, as if afraid to offend the overlord of the universe. Step. Step. Footsteps approached. He did not turn. He never needed to. Caliph entered the room with the easy confidence of someone who knew he was always welcome here, as he took the seat across from his father and poured himself tea without asking, copying the motion he had watched 1,000 times before. *TRRRR*. The timeless assassin glanced at him over the rim of his cup, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "So," he said as he set the cup down, his tone amused rather than curious, "you are finally spending your afternoons with your old man again." Caliph smiled lightly as he settled back. "I thought I would today," he replied as he lifted his own cup. "You always say the best conversations happen when nothing urgent is happening, and since you seem free today, I thought why not join you?" He explained as the timeless assassin hummed faintly in approval. "A carefully worded sentence. It gives the impression that you came here without a specific goal in mind, just to spend time with me. Which is not true, however, since it is not worded that way, your aura doesn't waver and I cannot catch the lie. You have truly become eloquent." The timeless assassin complimented, as Caliph bit his lips in shame. He knew his father was smart, however, he had hoped his trickery would not be caught today. Unfortunately for him though, he did not quite know how to fool him just yet. The duo sat in silence for a moment, tea cooling slowly between them, as eventually Caliph just bit back the guilt and bared his true intentions. "Father, I was reviewing the Chakravya formation recently, and had some doubts." He began as his gaze drifted toward the open archway, his voice casual, almost idle. I realized I never actually asked you about some of its limits. And about why you designed it the way you did. Caliph explained, as the timeless assassin raised an eyebrow, his fatherly smile deepening. Oh, he said as he tilted his head slightly. So you have picked up an interest in formations now? He asked as Caliph simply shrugged in response. I have to find some way to catch up to Soren, he replied as if stating an obvious truth. He has surpassed me as a warrior, and as the elder brother I need to find a way to get ahead of him once again. He confessed as the timeless assassin chuckled softly, the sound warm and unguarded. And here I thought you were just here to have afternoon tea with the old man. The timeless assassin teased as Caliph laughed once more with shame. I am not that filial, father, I think you know it all too well, he said as he shook his head. And neither is Soren. The timeless assassin studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. Ever since his children became gods, they seemed to have stopped caring for his approval and became their own men, as no longer were they filial in their duty towards him. Ask your question, son, I'll always teach you all I can. The timeless assassin said regardless, as he leaned forward slightly, the curiosity in his eyes burning bright as he expressed genuine desire in seeing what Caliph thought about his formation. You designed the Chakravya so that 4 demigods could power its core, correct? Caliph began, as the timeless assassin nodded in acknowledgement. So that even warriors who are not full gods can come together and take down gods by sealing away the 4th dimensional axis and forcing them into the 3-dimensional realm. Yes. The timeless assassin replied calmly, as he interrupted Caliph's question. Tremendous power should never be left without a leash. He clarified as Caliph nodded in agreement. But what if the core was changed? He asked as he looked back at his father. What if, instead of demigods, 4 gods powered the formation? And they used their aura to block out the 4th dimension? Completely. He asked as the timeless assassin did not answer immediately. Instead, he set his cup down with deliberate care, his fingers lingering for a fraction longer than necessary, as his eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in calculation. For a short time, the formation would resist itself. He said at last as Caliph leaned forward, attentive. But once it stabilizes, the timeless assassin continued as he lifted his hand, faint geometric rings blooming into existence between them, overlapping layers of light and law folding inward, the Chakravya would become unstoppable. The rings tightened, space subtly warping around their edges. If 4 gods power the core, he said as he looked directly at Caliph, then no one can break free from it. He declared as Caliph hesitated and gulped a mouthful of saliva. Gulp. Surely, he said carefully, you would be able to break free from it. Father, after all your strength surpasses the strength of all other gods put together. He praised, as the timeless assassin laughed a genuine sound, as he shook his head. No, my son, he said as his expression softened. Not even me. Caliph froze, just briefly. The Chakravya is a special formation. The timeless assassin continued, unaware of the weight settling behind his son's eyes. I created it so that gods would never stand above consequence. It allows weaker warriors to band together and kill a god if necessary. The rings dissolved into nothing. But if gods use it against another god, he said as his tone turned absolute, then whoever stands at its center is already dead. Caliph lowered his gaze, nodding slowly, absorbing every word with the reverence of a student. Yet beneath that calm, something else took shape. Not anger, not hatred, but understanding, as Caliph realized in that very moment that the greatest warrior to ever exist had just unknowingly explained exactly how, if ever, he could be killed. Chapter 877 The Cult Army. Planet Ixtal, Cult Assembly Plains, Unknown Soldiers POV. The line did not seem to end. No matter how far the soldier craned his neck, no matter how long he stared past the shoulders and backs of the men ahead of him, all he saw were bodies, banners, armor, cloaks, and more bodies beyond that, stretching across the plains in dense, unmoving ranks that swallowed the horizon whole. People. Just people everywhere. There's got to be like billions of us here, he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible beneath the low murmur of the crowd, as the realization settled in slowly that this was not a gathering meant for a practice drill, but rather a full-scale mobilization meant for actual war. The air itself felt heavy, not with heat or pressure, but with anticipation, as soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in disciplined disorder, some gripping their weapons a little too tightly, others staring straight ahead as if afraid to look anywhere else, while nervous whispers rippled through the mass like small cracks spreading across ice. All the divisions are here. I don't think there's anyone left behind. All the captains, sergeants, lieutenants, generals, and legion commanders are here too. So it's not just the lowest ranks who are mobilized. Two soldiers spoke quietly as they stared around them into the massive holographic screens that had been erected at regular intervals. Each one displaying the same live feed of a distant stage carved with an empty podium at its center, as four key cult figures stood behind the podium. The monarch commanders. Even from this distance, even through layers of projection and scale distortion, their presence was unmistakable, their posture rigid, their expressions unreadable, their auras suppressed yet impossible to fully hide, as they stood with straight backs as though waiting for someone important. Gulp. The soldier swallowed. Is it true? Someone beside him whispered, a young man who had only recently completed his basic army training. Is Lord Shadow Dragon really going to be here today? He asked, as a few heads turned and a few quiet smiles appeared. The veteran soldier glanced sideways, then nodded slowly. I think so, he replied, keeping his voice low. Today's mobilization day, with a force this large, and 4 of the 5 commanders already present. He trailed off, then exhaled. Yeah, I think the crowd's finally big enough for Lord Shadow Dragon to show himself. The words had barely finished leaving his mouth when it happened. The air shifted. Not violently, not explosively, just, domineeringly, as a pressure rolled across the plains in a single, silent wave, as though the sky itself had taken a breath and decided to exhale all at once, and in that instant, every conversation died, every soldier stiffened, every spine straightened, and every instinct screamed the same word: look above. Thousands of heads tilted upward in unison as the clouds parted without sound, and from the heavens, a lone figure descended slowly, robes fluttering calmly despite the absence of wind, black eyes cast downward without emotion or hesitation, as though he were not arriving to address an army, but to inspect something that already belonged to him. An overlord. The holographic screens flickered, then locked onto him instantly, magnifying his image across the plains, his face filling the sky in cold, perfect clarity as gasps rippled outward and silence became absolute. Land. He landed upon the stage without ceremony. No shockwave. No announcement. Just presence. The 4 monarchs turned as one. Commander Mickey James. Commander Anderson Silva. Commander Darnell Nuna. Commander Dupravel Nuna. They stood behind him in perfect formation as Leo turned slightly, acknowledging them with a brief nod, before facing forward once more and leaning in to speak into the microphone. Brave warriors of the cult, he said calmly, his tone steady rather than loud, yet somehow reaching every corner of the assembly. There was a time when I asked you all to abandon your pride, your honor, and your home planets, to follow me into the desolate stilled world. He paused, his gaze sweeping slowly across the sea of soldiers below, eyes moving not in haste, but with deliberate recognition. At the time, we were too weak to survive in the wider universe, Leo continued, his voice neither apologetic nor defiant. Too fractured, too hunted, too small. A low murmur rippled through the ranks. I know it was not an easy decision to make for you or your parents, he said as his expression softened just enough to be noticed. And I bear full responsibility for the humiliation many of you endured in doing so. The murmurs stilled. Yet you lot still supported me, Leo went on, his voice firming. You endured. And together, we took a desolate hellscape and made it livable again. His eyes lifted slightly, meeting the distant horizon. Together, we did not merely survive in that impossible world, he said. We thrived. The air seemed to tighten. But that time is over, Leo declared, his voice rising for the first time. The age of hiding is finished, and the time for revenge has come. He straightened fully now, presence expanding outward like a tide no one could resist. The time for the cult's resurgence has finally come. For half a second, the plains were silent. Then the world exploded. Roars tore from millions of throats at once, a thunderous wave of sound that shook the ground beneath their feet, banners snapping violently as fists rose skyward and weapons were lifted high, soldiers screaming until their voices cracked, until discipline dissolved into raw, unfiltered fervor. We endured. We return. We endured. We return. The cult remembers. The chants began unevenly, fragmented and wild, before swelling into something unified, something overwhelming, as the cult assembly plains became a living ocean of sound and devotion. Quake. Tremble. Leo soaked up the energy floating in the air, as he let the crowd heat up, letting the chants build, as he took a pause from his speech and let the soldiers vent their feelings for a while, before raising his hand to gesture for a pause. Chapter 878 The Vow. As soon as Leo raised his hand for silence, the crowd stilled, the chorus dying down almost instantly as millions of voices cut themselves short, discipline snapping back into place as they listened to him in rapt attention. As all of you must already know, the righteous bastards have gotten hold of our dragon, Aegon Ver, Leo said as his voice carried cleanly across the plains, stripped of theatrics and sharpened by anger he did not bother hiding. They have him, and instead of granting him a warrior's death as they should have, they rather chose humiliation. A ripple of restrained fury passed through the ranks. They paraded him, Leo continued as his gaze hardened, sweeping across the army. They caged him. They reduced him not because they feared his strength, but because they feared what he represents, and make no mistake, this was never about breaking just one cult dragon. He paused, letting the words settle. This was an attempt to break the cult's honor, Leo said as his tone lowered, heavier now. An attempt to fracture our unity. An attempt to remind us of what they believe we are beneath their order. Murmurs of anger stirred, but were quickly suppressed. When I first decided to save Ver, Leo said as his expression shifted, not softening, but turning inward, I asked myself a question I know many of you have asked yourselves as well. I asked whether it was right to risk the lives of billions for a single individual. His eyes moved slowly across the sea of soldiers. I know many of you wondered if this war was worth it. He said as his voice remained steady. I know some of you questioned whether one life justifies this scale of bloodshed. The silence deepened. But after thinking about it for a long time, Leo said as his posture straightened, I realized something fundamental. He lifted his hand slightly, fingers curling. The dragon is not just a single warrior, Leo said firmly. He is not just one life standing at the center of this conflict. His voice rose, conviction burning through it. He is the embodiment of our hopes, Leo said as his eyes sharpened. He is the embodiment of the dreams we carried through exile, through humiliation, through survival so desperate it barely deserved to be called living. A tremor ran through the crowd. And that is why we do not wage this war merely to save a dragon, Leo declared as his aura pressed outward, subtle but undeniable. We wage this war to protect those hopes. We wage it to prove that those dreams were never a mistake. He let that hang for a moment before continuing. For too long, Leo said slowly, for far too long, the cult remained passive. His jaw tightened. We stayed alive, he said as his voice grew colder. Barely. We managed what territories we could hold, not to grow, not to reclaim, but simply to avoid extinction. A few soldiers clenched their fists. Perhaps those times demanded restraint, Leo admitted as his gaze lifted slightly. Perhaps we truly could only handle so much. Then his eyes came back down. But passivity weakened us, Leo said as his tone sharpened. It made us smaller. It made us cautious. And now, we do not even have home planets left to defend anymore. The words struck like blows. In the end, Leo said as his voice hardened into something final, weakness breeds weakness. And the reluctance to fight necessary. Wars only ensures worse ones later. He straightened fully. So I say no more, Leo declared as his presence surged. We remain passive no more. We suffer no more. We fear no more. The air trembled. Yes, Leo continued as his voice lowered again, heavy with truth. Many of us will die for this revolution. Not a single soldier looked away. But those deaths will not be in vain, Leo said as his eyes burned with certainty. Every drop of cult blood spilled will become the catalyst for our resurgence. His hand tightened into a fist. Even if we do not live long enough to enjoy the fruits of our efforts. Leo said as his gaze swept across the army one final time. It is my promise to you that we will leave this universe a better place for the next generation to live in. The silence that followed was not empty. It was coiled. It was ready. And somewhere deep within the ranks, billions of hearts beat as one, no longer asking whether this war should be fought, but only when they would be unleashed. Leo let the silence stretch, not out of uncertainty, but control, as he allowed the weight of his words to settle fully into the hearts of those standing before him. Then he leaned forward slightly. "So my only question to you is this," Leo said as his voice carried across the plains, calm and absolute. "Who is with me?" For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the answer came. The plains erupted. A roar tore from billions of throats at once, raw and unrestrained, shaking the ground beneath their feet as soldiers slammed weapons against shields, blades raised high, banners snapping violently as they were thrust skyward, as the air itself seemed to ignite with movement. And sound. Revenge. Revenge. The cry rolled outward in waves, overlapping and growing louder with each repetition. Others shouted his title without restraint, voices cracking as they screamed it into the sky, the name carried by fury, devotion, and something far more dangerous than loyalty. Shadow Dragon. Shadow Dragon. The chants collided, fragmented at first, then blending into a single, overwhelming storm of sound, as discipline dissolved completely into fervor, as armor rattled, boots stamped, and the cult assembly plains became a living battlefield even before the war had begun. Leo stood unmoving at the center of it all, gray eyes calm as the chaos he had summoned, as he watched banners whip and weapons gleam. Beneath the open sky, as billions made the same decision at the same time, there was no hesitation left. No doubt remaining. The choice had been made. The cult would march. The war would begin. And the dragon would be saved. Chapter 879 The Need for War. En route from the time-stilled world, aboard the Central Command craft, Chaosbringer's POV. The sky above the time-stilled world burned with motion. From the vast launch platforms carved into suspended stone, tens of thousands of cult destroyers and troop carriers rose in disciplined waves, their hulls cutting through the stagnant heavens as engines flared to life, long columns of light tearing open the gray skies as the armada formed up for departure. Ahead of them, the exit point loomed like a wound in reality. A dimensional portal, wide enough to let only 3 ships pass at once stood waiting, as the armada passed through it in a continuous flow. The destroyers formed a spearhead, the escorts fanned outward, while the troop carriers held tight to the center, as one by one they entered the portal in perfect sequence, disappearing into that rippling seam as though the universe beyond was devouring them whole. At the heart of that moving formation flew a single craft, heavily guarded yet outwardly unremarkable, protected by overlapping defensive layers and silent escorts that would gladly burn themselves into ash before letting harm reach what they guarded. As inside that craft stood Leo, and beside him, the only other individual permitted to fly at his side, Chaosbringer watched the portal grow larger in the reinforced window, its shimmering surface reflecting across his eyes like liquid glass. "You know, my lord, there are many soldiers in the army who have never seen the universe outside the stilled world," Chaosbringer said as his gaze remained fixed on the gateway, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "This is the first time they are heading outside and they're lucky we are heading to Ixtal, for it is the birthplace of so many legends and stories that they have heard growing up." Leo did not look away. He pondered about what Chaosbringer said and nodded earnestly. "Yeah, there is a whole generation of warriors in the army now who do not have a home planet to call home," Leo said as his eyes traced the endless stream of ships slipping into the portal, their lights vanishing one after another into that impossible curtain. "We have been stuck in the time-stilled world for far too long." The portal's glow painted his face in cold, shifting light. "And I am afraid that if we do not come out now, time will start healing old wounds," Leo admitted as his voice remained calm, almost detached, as if he were speaking about weather rather than war. "The humiliation will fade, the anger will dull, and the masses will no longer want a war." Chaosbringer's smile thinned slightly. Leo's eyes narrowed, not with rage, but understanding. "Revenge does not age well, Chaosbringer," Leo said as he stared ahead, already understanding the human psyche well enough to see where time inevitably led. "It either burns hot enough to reshape history, or it cools into regret. And if we do not act now, it will cool into regret. And I can already see it happening." He admitted it plainly, as that realization became yet another reason behind why he wanted this war. Leo feared that if the cult did not fight now, they would then start to slowly grow content within the time-stilled world, satisfied with the safety and stability they had carved out for themselves, until the desire to step back into the wider universe faded altogether. The quality of life for the common people was improving rapidly within the stilled world, and with that improvement would inevitably come division. A faction would rise that valued peace over pride, Safety over legacy, a group that wished to remain hidden forever rather than reclaim what was lost. And that alone would be enough to kill the cult's historic beliefs in a single generation. Ver's kidnapping might just prove to be a blessing for us, Chaosbringer, Leo said as his tone remained steady despite the weight of his words. Even if it is difficult to predict how this will play out, in my understanding, we needed this war for our survival. Leo shared his conclusion as Chaosbringer immediately lowered his head and began offering words of praise. Your wisdom knows no bounds, my lord. To stand by your side truly enlightens me, Chaosbringer said as Leo scoffed lightly and shook his head. At first, Chaosbringer's odd behavior had bothered him. However, after decades spent alongside the man, Leo had grown accustomed to his antics. Not this, Leo said flatly. Tell me what you really feel. He encouraged him as Chaosbringer looked up and released a long, weary sigh, his expression losing its performative reverence as he gathered his true thoughts. Sigh. Chaosbringer said slowly, I think you are right, my lord. Time does heal wounds if enough of it passes. He paused. However, I do not think that applies to the cult for some reason. Leo raised an eyebrow slightly, listening. There are families within the cult whose last 50 ancestors have all lived and died with only one goal, Chaosbringer continued. To witness the cult's resurgence. So at this point, I believe it has become less of a dream and more of a compulsion, he said honestly. Almost genetic. I do agree that time heals all wounds, and that if we let a century pass without acting, then maybe there rises a faction who does not want to come back out, Chaosbringer added, but I do not believe it dulls the majority's desire to reclaim the cult's former glory, for to deny that dream, is to deny their blood itself. No matter how much time passes or how many generations rise and fall, the one constant binding the cult together is their hunger for revenge and their dream of resurgence. So maybe, it's not as severe as you think. Chaosbringer finished as it was Leo's turn to fall silent, his gaze hardening slightly as he considered the argument. There was merit in what Chaosbringer said. Leo could not deny that. Yet his own conclusion remained unchanged. The cult needed this war. And perhaps, in the end, it was for the best that they were finally getting it. Chapter 880 On Guard. The Righteous Faction's POV. News spread quickly amongst the righteous faction that a massive cult army had been spotted leaving the dimensional portal of the stilled world, as spycrafts positioned near the portal reported unusual activity. At first, the reports were not met with disbelief, nor with panic, but with a restrained acknowledgement, as contingency protocols that had existed only as simulations were quietly elevated to active status, and sealed channels lit up across administrative and military networks that had long prepared for this exact possibility. They had always known this could happen. Ever since intelligence leaks surfaced weeks earlier, detailing the cult's internal unrest and their likely reaction to Aegon Ver's scheduled execution, projections had circulated through high-clearance briefings, outlining a grim but expected response, one that involved coordinated retaliation strikes against no fewer than 12 righteous-controlled planets to be carried out on the same day as Aegon Ver's execution. The logic had been sound. The timing predictable. The intent clear. And yet, knowing something was possible was not the same as watching it unfold. As confirmation after confirmation streamed in, each sharper than the last, as fleet silhouettes stabilized on long-range sensors and portal distortion patterns aligned perfectly with mass transit signatures, even the most seasoned officials felt a tightening in their chests that no amount of preparation could fully suppress. They had expected this, but seeing it made it real. Estimates adjusted rapidly as analysts refined their models, troop strength figures settling between 3 and 4 billion as revised counts synchronized across intelligence hubs, while formation data painted a picture not of a chaotic exodus, but of discipline, hierarchy, and intent. This was not a reckless surge. This was an army. Sweat beaded beneath pristine collars and ceremonial armor as senior administrators and military commanders scrolled through live feeds in silence, their expressions carefully neutral even as the weight of confirmation pressed down upon them. So it begins, they mused, as they felt the small hope in their hearts shatter. The hope that perhaps the cult would not come out. That perhaps the cult would hesitate. That perhaps exile had softened them. That perhaps they did not have the courage to fight the righteous faction anymore after losing most of their homelands. However, unfortunately, those hopes died quietly as trajectory vectors were finalized. The fleet that had emerged from the stilled world was not dispersing. It was moving with purpose. Primary course projections converged unmistakably on planet Ixtal, the cult's ancestral ground and symbolic heart, as observers quickly realized that this was not yet the retaliation itself but its opening act. The execution was still 15 days away. Which meant this was positioning. Staging. A declaration made not through words, but through mass. Emergency councils convened across fortified command worlds, not to debate whether the cult would strike, but to finalize which planets would bleed first if containment failed, as veteran officers reviewed long-established response plans that had been prepared a week ago. They had prepared for this scenario. They had run the numbers. They had planned for the war. Yet planning for war and watching it begin were two very different things. And now that the cult had stepped back into the wider universe in force, heading first toward Ixtal, the righteous faction understood that the countdown had truly begun. Not to the execution, but to the day where history's most brutal clash would occur for the first time in over a millennia. Meanwhile, the Eternal Garden, Raymond's POV. Raymond stood beneath the layered boughs of the Eternal Garden, light filtering down through divine silver leaves, as a translucent data panel hovered before him, its contents scrolling slowly while his brows drew together in quiet displeasure. 4 billion. He read the number again, then again, as if repetition might make it grow. However, unfortunately it did not. This is wrong, he mused, as he realized that for an army meant to strike 12 planets in coordinated retaliation, the figure felt lacking. Something feels very wrong here, Raymond muttered as his fingers streams and pulling up raw projections instead. Traced idle patterns through the air, dismissing secondary data. 4 billion to attack 12 planets leaves them with barely 300 million soldiers per world. His eyes narrowed. And that is assuming equal distribution, he continued as his thoughts sharpened. But even then, with such pitiful attack numbers they would be outnumbered 3. 1 on the weakest worlds or 5, 1 on the strongest ones. Sigh. He let out a slow breath. Either their technology has advanced to the point where numbers no longer matter to their war strategy, or they are willingly sending their armies into battles where they will be heavily outmatched. Raymond said quietly, as neither explanation truly satisfied him. The cult's whole strategy currently made no sense to him. And yet, everyone else seemed to already know what was to come. Sigh. Raymond sighed heavily as his gaze drifted upward, past the floating data, into the vast blue sky of the garden, as a familiar unease crept in, the kind that came not from fear, but from pattern recognition. No, he murmured. This is not a frontal campaign. The cult had survived too long to be careless. Which meant the 12 planets were not the objective. They were noise. A distraction. However, just as he began to reorganize the projections, attempting to strip away the assumed targets and look for the absence instead, a presence entered the garden behind him, subtle but unmistakable, causing the air itself to tighten. Forget about the cult rats for now, boy, Caliph muttered as he strolled casually into the clearing, hands clasped behind his back, his expression one of mild annoyance rather than concern, as Raymond stiffened instantly and turned his head in respect. Greetings, father, he said without hesitation as Caliph acknowledged him with a small nod, his gaze already drifting past Raymond toward the floating data panels as if they were scarcely worth his attention. It does not matter what the rats do, Caliph said calmly. Or whether they conquer 12 planets or 120. He stopped beside Raymond, looking out over the endless expanse of the garden as if contemplating something far more important. What matters is Soren. Without him, the cult is nothing. Caliph continued, his voice sharpening slightly. Take him away and everything they build will collapse under its own weight. Caliph said as his eyes hardened. So the only question worth our attention is how to defeat Soren, because once that is done, the cult is already dead. He declared, as Raymond felt the wrongness deepen in his heart. Something about Caliph's approach to this situation did not sit right with him, yet, he still bowed his head and accepted his father's words, for he respected Caliph even more than his own intuition. I might be wrong here, but if the cult truly believes that Uncle Soren is their only pillar, then why would they care about conquering other planets? Surely, they understand what would happen to their organization if Soren dies as well, right? Raymond wondered, as he felt as though the cult strategist had gotten everyone wrapped around his fingers. That they were all looking everywhere except where it truly mattered, and that the whole situation was extremely dangerous. Chapter 881 Pain and Relief. Planet Ixtal, the Cult Army, a random soldier's POV. As the cult army landed on Ixtal in waves, the anger its soldiers felt over the destruction of its holy soil became boundless. Standing over its destroyed historical sites, as they bent down to touch the harrowed grounds beneath their feet, many of them felt something inside their chests crack open in a way that battle never had. This was not the clean ruin of war. This was erasure. All across the planet, the land told the same story. Historical sites were reduced to skeletal outlines scorched into the ground, academies that once trained legends collapsed into blackened stone, streets that had carried parades and laughter now buried beneath layers of glassed soil and drifting soot, as if the planet itself had been flayed and left exposed to the stars. Ixtal was supposed to be sacred. It was the place spoken of in lullabies and old stories, the world every cult child learned about before they ever learned how to fight, the birthplace of Soren and the cradle of everything the cult believed itself to be. Even those who had never stepped foot on its soil had grown up imagining its forests, its cities, its towers, as symbols rather than geography. And now those symbols lay broken beneath their boots. FSSHH. Land. As more and more soldiers landed and moved out of their transport crafts, the grief only deepened. There were no cheers, no chants, no triumph, only breathing. A random soldier knelt without realizing he had done so, fingers brushing through the gray ash coating the ground, as he felt it clinging to his skin, staining him, as if the planet itself refused to let him leave untouched. Ash. Not soil. Not stone. Ash that had once been homes, libraries, shops, and living things that no longer existed. Around him, others did the same. Veterans hardened by decades of conflict sank to one knee, their shoulders trembling as they stared at the ruins in silence, while younger soldiers stood frozen, eyes wide, trying and failing to reconcile the stories they had grown up hearing with the devastation in front of them. Somewhere nearby, an older man let out a sound that did not quite become a sob, his hands shaking as he pressed his forehead against the ground, lips moving in a prayer that had no one left to hear it. He had been born here. That much was clear from the way his fingers traced invisible lines across the ruins, as though he still remembered where the streets had been, where the markets used to open at dawn, where children once ran without fear beneath banners that no longer flew. Others joined him, quietly, without ceremony. There was no shame in the tears. No one mocked them. No one turned away. This grief belonged to all of them, because even those who had never lived on Ixtal understood what this destruction meant. If the righteous had done this to Ixtal, then their home planets were likely no different. The thought spread through the army without words. Burned skies. Flattened cities. Erased histories. Worlds that had once been theirs, reduced to warnings. As anger followed the grief, slow and inexorable, rising not as a roar but as a pressure behind the eyes and beneath the ribs, a shared understanding that settled into every heart present. This was not collateral damage. This was a message. A message by the enemy that said, "You and your culture are not allowed to exist under the same heavens as us." AGHHHHH. The old soldier screamed as he rose to his feet, ash still clinging to his hands, as he felt something essential break inside him in a way that could not be repaired. Around him, billions of others felt it too, the moment grief turned into resolve, as tears dried, backs straightened, and gazes lifted from the ruins toward the sky. This was not the Ixtal they remembered, and unless they took action now and brought the fight to the enemy, this would be the future of every cult land they dared to live on. Meanwhile Soren watched the cult armies land on Ixtal in disciplined waves, as he felt his strength begin to return with every new presence that set foot upon his ruined home world. "I am still their sect master," Soren murmured to himself, his voice quiet yet steady as his gaze lingered over the broken land. "These are my people." The words settled deep within him, not as pride, but as certainty, as he reminded himself that no matter how much the enemy had already taken, no matter how weak and diminished he had become, the cult had still come. Not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because they chose to. Because they believed in him. From his vantage point, Soren watched them spread across Ixtal's shattered surface, landing with the discipline and restraint of a true army. As he closed his eyes briefly and drew in a slow breath, feeling something warm stir within his chest. Strength. Not the sharp, violent power that once shattered mountains, but something older and steadier, something that eased the ache in his soul even as his battered body protested every movement. Each soldier who set foot on Ixtal felt like a thread reconnecting him to the world, binding him back together piece by piece, until the emptiness he had carried for so long began to recede. They came for me, Soren murmured, the realization alone pushing back the creeping cold of death that had lingered at the edges of his awareness for far too long. Soren had lived a long life, long enough to understand that power faded and flesh failed, but faith endured in quieter, more enduring ways. Watching these young men and women stand among the ruins, some grieving, some furious, all resolute, filled him with a peace he had not felt in centuries. This was his cult. Not the buildings, not the forests, not even the old stone castle. The people. And as they gathered, as their presence breathed life back into a planet that had been declared dead, Soren felt himself smile faintly. The expression soft and genuine. Whatever awaited him next, whatever fate the righteous had planned, he knew he would not face it alone. For as long as his people stood with him, Soren understood one thing. With absolute clarity. He was not finished yet. Capitulo 882, The Spart 1. The next day, Soren's castle, Leo's POV. Sweat rolled down Leo's forehead in tiny beads as he soaked up the pressure of Soren's aura without cracking, his breathing slow and controlled even as his lungs burned and his body screamed in protest. The hell is this pressure? He wondered, as the training arena around him began to feel smaller than it should have, not because of its size, but because of who stood across from him. As Leo became acutely aware of every sensation inside his own body, the tension in his shoulders, the strain in his calves, the faint tremor in his wrists as he subtly adjusted his grip. Gulp. Soren stood opposite him, relaxed to the point of being infuriating. His posture was loose, his shoulders at ease, while a single wooden dagger rested lightly in his hand as if it were an afterthought rather than a weapon, his expression calm, focused, and faintly amused, like a man watching a child struggle rather than facing a genuine opponent. Damn it. It doesn't even look like he's trying, Leo thought, the realization pressing heavier than the aura itself as he involuntarily took a step back. The pressure radiating from Soren was steady and unyielding. And although the great god did not seem to be using even a fraction of his true strength, Leo already felt himself nearing his limits. Despite having an aura shield activated, which mitigated some of the pressure bearing down on him, he still found himself forced to consciously regulate his mana circulation just to remain upright, as though the air itself had decided he needed permission to stand. Clench. Leo tightened his grip on the twin steel blades in his hands, the hilts slick with sweat, as the strain rippled from his eyes down through his forearms, as if every muscle in his body was being drained simply to maintain eye contact. His opponent today was a god. A genuine one, a being with command over 4 dimensions. And he was trying to stand against him. Soren's invitation had come without warning earlier that morning, a short, almost casual request to spar in the castle's arena, as if this were a normal occurrence rather than something that should have shaken Leo to his core. I'm really doing this, Leo had thought then. However, now, standing beneath that quiet, suffocating pressure, he finally understood why chances like this were never meant to be common, as every second spent under Soren's gaze peeled away his confidence and replaced it with something far more honest. Shuffle. Soren shifted slightly, the wooden dagger turning lazily between his fingers, as Leo reacted instantly to that movement, his spine stiffening as his senses snapped tight, instinct surging ahead of thought as it warned him that this calm was deceptive. He hasn't moved yet, Leo realized. And I'm already ready to wet myself. The thought unsettled him, as Soren's eyes traced over him, measuring rather than judging, as it was right here that he realized that this spar had never been about victory or defeat. Because if Soren really wanted to beat him, he would already have lost his life 1,000 times over. Sigh. Leo exhaled slowly, forcing the tremor out of his breath as he raised his blades a fraction higher, sweat dripping from his jaw onto the stone below. This was not a fight meant to be won. This was a lesson. And whatever Soren intended to teach him was likely something that would take him a very long time to truly understand on his own, which was why this opportunity was golden. Do you see where you lack, Shadow Dragon? Soren asked at that moment, his voice calm and composed yet carrying a weight that pressed just as heavily as his aura, as Leo felt the question settle over him more painfully than any physical blow could have. Leo clenched his jaw, the pressure in the arena coiling tighter around him as he stared at the god's feet in suppression. "I guess everywhere," Leo replied honestly, the words leaving his mouth without hesitation. "There isn't a single place where I don't fall short." For a brief moment, Soren chuckled, the sound soft and unforced, as though Leo's answer amused him rather than disappointed him, yet he shook his head slowly, eyes still locked onto Leo with quiet focus. "Well yes," Soren said as his faint smile lingered, "but that is the answer of a man overwhelmed, not the answer of a man trying to survive." He took a single step forward, not threatening and not hurried, yet the pressure in the arena shifted instantly, forcing Leo's muscles to tighten on instinct. "Think more specifically," Soren continued, his tone patient rather than instructive. "If tomorrow you face an opponent stronger than yourself, someone faster, stronger, more experienced, what is the very first thing you must mitigate in order to make that fight even remotely fair?" Leo frowned, brows drawing together as the question echoed through his mind. Strength. No. That gap could not be closed in a single fight. Speed. That too felt insufficient, something that could be exploited but not erased. He drew a slow breath, grounding himself as he tried to dissect the problem the way Soren intended, piece by piece, yet every answer he reached felt incomplete, as though he were circling something fundamental without ever touching it. Durability. But durability only delayed the inevitable. Technique. Technique mattered, but technique alone could not bridge gaps this wide. Leo's thoughts tangled, frustration creeping in as he realized that every solution he considered required time, refinement, or power he did not currently possess, making them useless in a battle that would happen tomorrow. His grip tightened unconsciously around his blades as he searched for something, anything, that could turn an unwinnable fight into one he could endure. Nothing came. The silence stretched. Soren did not interrupt him. Did not guide him. Did not rescue him. He simply waited. Leo finally exhaled, shoulders lowering slightly as he tilted his head and looked back at Soren, confusion clear in his eyes despite his attempt to hide it. "I don't know," he admitted silently, the realization cutting deeper than any blow could have. And as he met Soren's steady gaze, Leo understood that this moment of not knowing was exactly where the lesson was meant to begin. Capitulo 883, The Spark 2. Soren did not respond to Leo's confusion right away. Instead, he loosened his grip on the wooden dagger and let it rest naturally at his side, the weapon treated less like an instrument of combat and more like a forgotten prop now that the spar had shifted into something else, as his gaze remained steady, patient, and quietly analytical. "Fighting gods or demigods at your current stage is stupid," Soren said calmly, his tone neither harsh nor condescending. "There is not a single metric in which you can match them." Leo frowned slightly, but he did not argue. "Strength, speed, skill, endurance, aura control, experience," Soren continued evenly. "In every measurable category, you lose." The words did not sting the way Leo expected them to. They landed cleanly, like statements of fact rather than criticism, and that made them far harder to dismiss. "So if you insist on fighting them on equal footing, you die. There is no honor in that, only waste." Soren said this as Leo lowered his blades a fraction, his jaw tightening as the truth settled in. "Then what am I supposed to do?" The question surfaced unbidden, sharp and uncomfortable, as the solution continued to elude him. "That is why the answer becomes obvious," Soren said, as though responding directly to the thought forming in Leo's mind. "You cannot win against immortals on your own terms." Leo looked up. "But you can deny them the right to win on theirs." The sentence lingered between them, and Leo felt his thoughts finally begin to align. "What do you think immortals rely on when fighting mortals?" Soren asked, his head tilting slightly, not in challenge but quiet contemplation. "They do not rely on power, because power is abundant to them. Nor do they rely on technique, because theirs has already been refined beyond comparison." He paused, allowing the implication to settle. "They rely on certainty," Soren said. "Certainty that they are stronger. Certainty that they cannot lose. Certainty that you are beneath them." He explained as something shifted inside Leo's thoughts, faint but unmistakable. "And certainty breeds negligence," Soren continued. "When a being believes it cannot lose, it stops guarding against loss. It is like competing against a child in sport. You know you cannot lose, so you stop paying attention. That confidence feels natural, but it is dangerous. Soren explained, as Leo felt a thin fog starting to lift from his mind. Their belief in their own superiority makes them more likely to make mistakes, Soren said. Because while they fight equals with perfect form, perfect focus, and absolute discipline, they fight mortals far too casually. His voice remained calm and unhurried, as though he were stating a law of nature rather than offering advice. So the question becomes simple, Soren continued. How do you make them commit a mistake? You destabilize them with creativity, Leo answered, certainty entering his voice for the first time as Soren smiled. Exactly. The only metric where you can match a god, or even surpass one, is creativity, Soren said. It cannot be trained in the same way. It does not rely on experience. And it cannot be predicted. For someone as weak as you, it is the only path to victory. But used correctly, it can lead to miracles. Leo's eyes brightened with understanding. You fabricate scenarios out of nothing, you introduce variables they did not account for, and you force them to react instead of act, Soren said. And if you are fortunate, maybe once in 10,000 times, they make a mistake you can exploit. Leo felt something stir in his chest as the concept finally locked into place. When any warrior is forced to react to an unexpected situation they were not taking seriously, their judgment falters, Soren explained. And immortals are no exception. His gaze remained fixed on Leo, measuring understanding rather than readiness. And in those rare moments, they make mistakes they would never make otherwise. That is your window. Soren let the silence settle. Leo slowly lifted his head, his eyes no longer clouded with confusion, but narrowed in thought as the lesson fully took hold. Against gods, power meant nothing. Fairness was irrelevant. The fight was decided long before the first strike was ever thrown. And the only chance he had, a 1 in 10,000 shot at best, lay in creativity, in forcing the unexpected, and in turning a single mistake into victory. So don't get dragged into a dog fight when you fight a god. Don't engage them stupidly in a battle of bronze. Don't try to outfight them. Because all that would inevitably lead to you losing. Instead, just be creative. Soren offered, his voice calm and unhurried, as if he were correcting a simple misconception rather than dismantling everything Leo thought he understood about combat. And in that moment, Leo finally understood what he had done wrong in today's spar. He had stood against Soren like a fool, daggers raised, posture locked, waiting for him to advance as if he could truly block a god's attacks if he unleashed a flurry at the right moment, when what he should have done was run, reposition, distort the flow of the fight, or force Soren into situations he did not expect. He had treated the spar like a duel, when it had never been one. Against a god, standing still is the same as losing. The realization settled deep, heavy and undeniable, as Leo replayed the opening seconds of the spar in his mind, seeing now how absurd it had been to wait, to brace, to pretend that timing and technique alone could close a gap measured in dimensions rather than skill. Sigh. Leo let out a deep sigh as his shoulders finally loosened, the tension bleeding out of him not because the pressure was gone, but because understanding had replaced confusion. Even if he did everything correctly, even if he ran, baited, misdirected, disrupted Soren's rhythm and forced him to react rather than act, the odds were still overwhelmingly against him. Against a god, his chances of victory were next to none. Even with perfect execution, even with fate bending in his favor, the only scenario where he could truly kill a god was if he wielded an origin blade, something capable of cutting through the laws that protected beings like Soren. Without it, creativity could only buy time. While against a demigod, the picture was marginally better, but still brutal. 9,999 losses out of 10,000. Those were the real numbers. Cold, unforgiving, honest. Yet instead of discouraging him, that truth grounded him. Because now he understood that today's failure had not come from weakness alone, but from approaching an impossible opponent with the wrong mindset. He had tried to fight a god like a warrior, when what he needed to be was something else entirely. I get it now, Leo thought, as he straightened slowly, blades lowering at his sides as he looked back at Soren, no longer confused, no longer frustrated, but thoughtful. This spar had never been about winning. It had been about stripping away the illusion. And now that illusion was gone, he finally saw the slim path to victory. Chapter 884 The Chasm. Soren's Castle, Leo's POV. Leo thought about Soren's lesson for a long moment before eventually nodding in understanding, as he cupped his fists together and bowed deeply before him, the gesture sincere and unforced. "Thank you for the lesson," Leo said as he straightened slowly. Soren nodded in acknowledgement, his expression unchanged, calm and distant as ever, as if the entire exchange had been no more than a passing conversation, before he turned slightly, clearly intending to end the day there. "Sect Master," Leo called out. Soren paused. Leo hesitated for half a heartbeat, then scratched the back of his neck lightly, an awkward gesture that felt strangely human in the presence of a god. "While I do appreciate the philosophical lesson," Leo said, choosing his words carefully, "I still want to exchange blows with you just once." He requested as Soren glanced back at him, one brow lifting faintly. "Just one chance," Leo continued. "Not to win, not to prove anything. I just want to know how wide the gap truly is between us." For a moment, Soren studied him in silence, then a low chuckle escaped his lips, warm and genuine. "Why not?" Soren said easily, amusement flickering in his eyes as he turned fully to face Leo again, the wooden dagger once more resting properly in his grip. "Do you want me to go easy on you?" Soren asked calmly, "or do you want to see my true strength?" He asked, as Leo answered without hesitation. "Your true strength. I can only understand the chasm between us if you don't hold back. Though I know if you release your peak strength from the start, I probably won't even be able to move. So at least let me make the first move," he requested as Soren considered him for a brief moment, then nodded once. "Very well," he said simply, gesturing for Leo to prepare, as Leo drew in a slow, deep breath before stepping back, his mind clearing as he replayed Soren's words from earlier, the lesson still echoing loudly in his thoughts. "Creativity," he thought as he steadied his stance, daggers hanging loose at his sides as his aura began to unfurl, no longer compressed defensively but spread thin across the arena, while mana surged through his circuits in a deliberate, unfamiliar pattern. "I should use that move," Leo thought, eyes locking onto Soren's unmoving form as his grip tightened imperceptibly around his daggers, his focus narrowing until the rest of the arena faded into the background. The god did not shift, did not brace, did not react. He simply stood there, relaxed and open, honoring his promise as if what Leo was about to attempt was not even worth acknowledging, his posture loose, weight settled evenly, the wooden dagger resting idly in his hand as though combat had already ended. "He hasn't even assumed a battle stance, but I still see no opening," Leo thought, as Soren's calm unsettled him more than any visible hostility could have. Something about it felt wrong, as if the world itself was waiting for a cue it had already missed. As Leo drew in a breath and began circulating mana more aggressively, his aura unfurling outward in response as his muscles coiled in preparation. He moved, only half a step, just enough to begin closing the distance. And Soren disappeared, not in a blur, not in a burst of speed. Simply gone, as the space directly in front of him emptied without transition, his eyes still clinging to Soren's outline for a fraction of a second longer than reality allowed, as if his perception itself had been left behind. Where, he wondered, confusion flashing through his mind as his instinct screamed too late. Something touched his stomach. At first, Leo did not register it as pain, as the sensation arrived muted and dense, like a heavy pressure being applied all at once, compressing muscle and breath together, as though an invisible weight had been pressed into his core. Then the pressure sank deeper. Air tore violently from his lungs as his diaphragm seized his breath, leaving him in a broken, soundless gasp as his vision warped and folded inward, the arena tilting sharply as the sensation spread outward in slow, merciless waves. Pain followed a heartbeat later. Not sharp, not explosive, but consuming. It bloomed outward from the point of contact, crawling up his ribs and down his spine, flooding his limbs with weakness as he dimly realized that his feet were no longer touching the ground. His body lifted, not thrown, displaced. The world rotated sideways as the force finally caught up to his awareness, stone blurring beneath him as balance was ripped away entirely, his muscles refusing to respond as his thoughts began to fragment under the sheer wrongness of it. What just happened, he thought weakly, as the question dissolved before it could fully form. Why were there no intent lines behind his attack? Why did I see no openings or attack path? He wondered, as his aura, which he had spread thin and wide across the arena in preparation for his attack, vanished in the same instant, not torn apart or crushed, but blown away completely, peeled off the space around him like fog before a roaring wind, leaving him suddenly exposed. He felt it retreat, felt the hollow absence where it had been, as the emptiness terrified him more than the pain. I'm still too far off to even understand what the peak looks like, he thought, as the darkness crept in from the edges of his vision and his consciousness faded. Thud. His body landed hard on the stone floor, his eyes having already rolled to the back of his head, as Soren stood above him with a gentle smile on his face. So this is what father must have seen every day when I challenged him at the monarch tier, he muttered, as old memories flooded him. Memories from when he was just a weak monarch, and his father was the god, as he bent down and closed Leo's eyelids before turning to leave. Chapter 885 Reflection. Planet Ixtal, Cult Camp, Leo's POV. Gasp. Leo woke with a sharp intake of breath as his body jerked slightly, his awareness snapping back into place before his eyes fully opened, as the first thing he felt was a dull, aching soreness radiating from his abdomen. His hand moved there on instinct. Wince. Pain flared faintly at the contact, not sharp enough to cripple him, but persistent enough to remind him that whatever Soren had done had not been gentle, even if it had been effortless. What the hell was that attack? Leo wondered, his thoughts slow and heavy as he stared up at the canvas ceiling of a small tent, light filtering through the fabric in muted hues as the distant sounds of the cult camp drifted in faintly. He lay there for a few seconds longer, breathing steadily as he took in his surroundings. The faint smell of treated cloth and earth lingered in the air, while the low murmur of soldiers training sounded outside. However, he didn't focus on those sounds for long, as soon the memory of him being knocked out resurfaced. He just vanished, Leo thought, as he replayed the chain of events in his head. Soren vanishing, the pressure, the impact, the way everything ended before it ever truly began. Charles had warned me about this. He had warned me to not rely on intent too much, Leo thought, his brows knitting slightly as the recollection surfaced. At the time, Leo had not fully understood what the smoking man meant. Intent had always been reliable, infallible, even against monarchs and anything below them. Intent revealed openings, trajectories, killing paths, making combat feel almost transparent. But Soren's attack today had carried none of that. No intent lines, no warning, no readable flow, as intent betrayed him for the first time in his life. Sigh. Leo exhaled slowly as that realization settled in, not with panic but with clarity. It's fragile. Intent works on beings who still operate within the same framework as me, but gods are beyond it. He realized, as the truth clicked into place. Against immortals who moved beyond the third dimension, it was nothing more than a crutch. Yet strangely, he did not feel bitter. If anything, he felt relieved. Better now than later. Better in a spar than in real combat, Leo thought, as his fingers curled slightly against the bedding, his mind once again drifting to the moment just before he lost consciousness. It wasn't just the intent. I couldn't even use my special technique, he realized, as the unease deepened. He had already begun to move. The mana circulation had started. The technique had been initiated. And yet, Soren had countered him mid-motion, knocking him out before the move could even manifest, at a speed which was simply beyond his comprehension. I wasn't even at the stage where I could attempt a strike. I did not even have the skill to try, Leo thought grimly, as he realized that the gap between him and a god was even wider than he had initially imagined. He shifted, pushing himself upright with a faint grunt as he swung his legs off the bed, stretching carefully as his muscles protested mildly. The way he blew away my aura was strange too. I still don't understand how he did it, Leo thought, flexing his fingers slowly, before pausing. But at least I've seen it with my own eyes now, he thought, as he felt happy that he had witnessed peak strength, which made this sparring session not a loss for him at all. Crack, crack. Leo stood fully, rolling his shoulders as he straightened, the soreness already beginning to fade as his recovery kicked in. While saving there, I need to avoid god-level opponents at all costs. I'm not ready to face them at my current stage, Leo muttered aloud, his voice low and steady as he took in a slow breath. If I see one coming for me, then praying and running away are my only options, he concluded without shame, as he acknowledged his limits and decided to stay well within them to stay alive. 12 days left, just 12. He reminded himself, as he thought about the deadline to Vare's execution and what all he needed to achieve before then, with the most important task being the meeting with the cult monarchs, as he drilled the war plan into them in precise detail. There can be no mistakes made, he murmured, as the words left his mouth quietly, more a vow to himself than a statement meant for anyone else to hear, as his thoughts sharpened and began organizing themselves with cold efficiency. This war was not going to be won by passion or hatred. It was going to be won by precision. Leo knew that once the day of Vare's execution arrived, the righteous faction would already be operating at peak alertness, their elites prepared, their weapons sharpened and their traps laid in anticipation of retaliation, which meant that any deviation, any delay, any misunderstanding among his commanders would cascade outward into disaster for the cult. Every monarch needs to understand the intent behind each movement, not just the orders themselves, he thought, as the image of the upcoming meeting took shape in his mind. He would walk them through every phase of the war plan, step by step, explaining not only where they would strike, but where they would not, which formations were bait, which legions were expendable, and which responses from the righteous armies were acceptable and which ones required immediate deviation. They were his blades, and blades that did not move in unison were useless. I need them thinking 3 steps ahead, not reacting in the moment, Leo thought, as he thought about how saving Vare would need everyone to perform at 110%, with there being no room for mistakes. The next 12 days were not going to be about training soldiers or refining formations. Those systems were already in motion. Instead, they were going to be about alignment. About making sure that when the first signal was given, 4 billion lives moved as one, without hesitation, without doubt, and without error. Inhale. Leo took another steady breath, feeling the soreness in his abdomen fade further into the background as resolve replaced reflection. He realized that he no longer had time to waste thinking about past mistakes, for the greatest war fought in the past millennium was approaching fast. And his job, above all else, was to make sure that when it did, the cult did not falter even once. Chapter 886 Momentum. Planet Ixtal, Cult Camp, Council Tent. Silence hung inside the command tent long after Leo finished speaking, heavy and unmoving, as the glowing projections of the war map slowly dimmed and faded, leaving the 5 cult monarchs standing around the table with nothing but their own thoughts for company. For several heartbeats, no one spoke. Su Pei was the first to lift his gaze, looking toward Darnell Nuna, only to find the man already staring back at him, his expression tight and unreadable. Across from them, Anderson Silva pinched the bridge of his nose slowly, while Mickey James leaned back against one of the tent's support pillars, arms folded across his chest, jaw clenched as if grinding his teeth would somehow make the plan less insane. Dupravel Nuna remained still, eyes fixed on the table where the projections had been moments ago. While, at the far end of the tent, Dumpy sat cross-legged on the ground, broad back straight, arms folded comfortably, eyes half-lidded, a faint, confident smirk etched permanently onto his wide green face. Is it too late to run away yet? The thought surfaced quietly, almost shyly, in more than one mind. Can we not take part in this war? No one said it out loud. But as their gazes met, briefly and then again, they all recognized the same unease being reflected back at them, the other man having the same doubts as themselves. The Lord's plan is insane. They all thought at once, as they realized that the plan demanded perfection. There were no redundancies, no safety nets, no room for heroics or improvisation. If one of them failed, the rest would not simply suffer for it, but rather collapse because of it, which meant that the plan had literally no room for error. Sigh. Eventually, Dupravel exhaled slowly and straightened, breaking the silence through sheer force of will. The terrifying part about the Lord's plan is that none of us are acting independently. We are all individual links in a single chain, and that chain is only as strong as its weakest link. It is not enough that 4 out of 5 of us hold our ground. Every front has to succeed, because the moment even one collapses, the rest of us will fall like a deck of cards. The words lingered in the tent. Mickey James dragged a hand down his face and let out a slow breath. This is the most dangerous plan I've ever heard in my life. Anderson Silva nodded once. Dangerous feels like an understatement. Su Pei, who had been quiet until now, finally let out a short, breathy laugh as he rolled his shoulders and straightened. Well, I won't pretend like I'm not scared. But at the same time, I kind of get it. This is how legends are made. Either I die as nothing, or I become Su Pei of the cult, a name remembered for 1,000 years. His words hung in the air. Mickey snorted softly and shrugged. When you put it like that, it's hard to say no. Anderson chuckled under his breath. A shot at eternal glory does sound tempting. Darnell Nuna finally spoke, his voice steady despite the tension coiling through the tent. If the Lord believes this is our best chance, then I'll see it through. One by one, their gazes drifted toward the last presence in the tent. Dumpy remained seated, unmoving, his expression unchanged. Then his smirk widened just a fraction. Confident, relaxed, as if this war was already decided. And for reasons none of them could quite explain, that confidence alone made the crushing weight in their chests ease ever so slightly. Since I was born as a small toad, I haven't yet seen Lord Father's plan fail even once. Him and Chaosbringer, when those two make a plan, victory is all but inevitable. Dumpy assured, as his words immediately suppressed some of the tension in the room, allowing everyone else to stand straighter. I guess the lives of myself and my men depend on each and every one of you in this room. So don't you dare fuck up. Dupravel warned, as the weight behind those words settled heavily over the council tent, no longer abstract or strategic but painfully personal. For a brief moment, no one responded. Then Darnell Nuna stepped forward slightly, planting his feet with quiet resolve as his gaze moved from Dupravel to the others. We won't, he said simply, the certainty in his voice unforced. If the chain breaks, it surely won't be on my end. Anderson Silva followed, straightening from where he stood, his earlier tension replaced by a sharp, focused calm. My front will hold as well, he said. Whatever the righteous throw at us, I'll make sure it doesn't reach anyone else. Mickey James pushed himself off the pillar and rolled his shoulders once, the sound of armor shifting softly in the tent. This is light work for me, he added. No righteous warrior will plow through my unit. If the signal comes, we move exactly as planned. Su Pei exhaled slowly, then nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, not of confidence but acceptance. Well, he said, looks like we're all in too deep to flinch now. Their eyes met again, not searching this time, but affirming, as something subtle but important changed in the air, fear giving way to commitment, doubt giving way to purpose. At the far end of the tent, Dumpy finally unfolded his arms and rose to his feet, towering slightly as he looked around the room with an expression that bordered on amused. If any of you make a mistake, or find yourselves in trouble, then I'll just smash your enemies and rescue you like a princess, he declared, as the simplicity of the statement drew a short, incredulous laugh from Mickey, while even Anderson's stern expression softened slightly. That was enough. Not reassurance, not certainty, but momentum. Dupravel nodded once, slow and deliberate, as he decided to not look back now. We either win together, or we fall together, he declared, as no one argued. Outside the tent, the distant sounds of 4 billion soldiers continued. Unabated, drills running, formations shifting, weapons being checked and rechecked, as the machinery of war moved forward with relentless precision. Inside, 5 commanders and 1 frog stood aligned beneath the weight of a plan that demanded perfection. And for the first time since Leo had finished speaking, none of them wondered whether they could run. They only wondered whether they would be worthy of what came next, and whether this could be the war that made them legends. Chapter 887 Transporting the Prisoner. 2 days before the execution, the Eternal Garden, Ver's POV. Hunger gnawed at Ver's insides in dull, relentless waves as he hung suspended in the darkness, his wrists bound high above his head by cold, unyielding chains that bit into his skin every time his weight shifted, even slightly. The room was pitch black. Not the comforting dark of night, but the absolute kind, the kind that swallowed depth and distance whole, leaving him with nothing but the sound of his own breath and the faint scrape of metal whenever his body swayed. Days had passed, or maybe weeks, he no longer knew. There had been no markers of time here, no voices, no footsteps, no sounds beyond his own breathing and the occasional dry rasp of his throat when his body demanded water that never came. Gurgle, grumble, his stomach cramped again, sharp and insistent, as his head dipped forward weakly, strands of matted hair falling over his eyes. Not many days left now. The thought came unbidden, quiet and heavy, as his biological clock whispered what the darkness refused to confirm. The date of his execution was drawing close, and with it came the inescapable awareness of death. Shine. Suddenly, light tore through the cell as a door opened somewhere ahead, flooding the black floor with brilliance for a fleeting moment as Ver hissed softly and squeezed his eyes shut, his pupils contracting painfully from the sudden assault. Footsteps echoed, measured, unhurried. Then, as he forced his eyes open again, a silhouette stood framed in the doorway, light pooling around the figure's edges as a glowing orb floated lazily in one hand. Raymond stepped inside. The door slid shut behind him, plunging the room back into shadow, save for the cold glow of the orb that illuminated the cell just enough to reveal Ver's chained form. "Oh cousin, you've grown so much more miserable since the last time I saw you." Raymond's voice carried easily, light and amused, as he approached and tilted his head slightly, inspecting Ver like an art piece left to rot. "I bet you wish you had kept teaching me those forbidden moves now." He smiled wider. "At least then, you would have lived your last days as an honored guest of the Eternal Garden, instead of wallowing in hunger and misery like this. Always remember cuz, you brought this on yourself. You chose to protect the cult cunts till your last breath even though it was futile and useless, and as a result, you lost the little joy you could have had in your final moments as a man. How pitiful." Raymond mocked as Ver lifted his head slowly, his neck protesting as his eyes met Raymond's through the dim light, contempt burning brighter than exhaustion. "Fuck off." The words came out hoarse, but firm. Raymond froze for half a heartbeat, then burst into laughter, the sound echoing unnaturally loud through the confined space as he clapped his hands together, delight written plainly across his face. "Ha ha ha." He nodded appreciatively, still chuckling. "Very good. This is very, very good," he said as he circled Ver leisurely. "A defiant dragon will make for great cinema when the time for execution comes. I was worried for a while that a helpless version of you might make a few mortals pity your death." His smile sharpened. "But thankfully, with this attitude of yours, they won't," Raymond said, as he stopped before Ver once more and stepped closer, his hands reaching upward toward the chains as metal shifted and locks disengaged. Click. Ver's eyes widened slightly as the tension vanished from his wrists. "You're unchaining me. Does that mean today's my execution day?" he asked, as Raymond paused, then shrugged casually. "No, unfortunately it's not," he replied before continuing to work on the restraints. "You have 2 more days left to live, but I've been ordered to transport you to the pit today," he said before straightening. "Apparently, Morris the Snake doesn't trust my father enough to deliver you on time if we wait until the last day, so I'm taking you there now," he said as his smile returned. "Exhale." A soft breath escaped Ver's lips despite himself, relief and dread twisting together in his chest. Knowing exactly when he was scheduled to die did not make it easier on his mind. However, it did make it possible to prepare. Clank, clank, thud. The final bindings released as Ver dropped heavily to the floor, his legs buckling instantly beneath him as numbness robbed them of strength, pain flaring sharply through his joints as he collapsed to one knee. Pant pant. He stayed there for a moment, breathing hard, before forcing himself upright with trembling effort, as Raymond watched closely, waiting with faint hope that Ver might retaliate somehow, only to be disappointed when he did not. Seconds passed, yet nothing happened, as Ver neither attacked nor ran, the lack of resistance draining the amusement from Raymond's expression. "TCH, what a buzzkill," Raymond complained, as he sighed theatrically and waved a hand dismissively. "I was hoping for a small scuffle so I could beat the ever-loving snot out of you." He turned and gestured toward the door. "But I don't want to anymore since you've taken all the fun out of it," Raymond said, as he stepped aside and the exit opened. Ver limped forward, each step heavy and uneven, his body weak but his spine straight, as he passed through the threshold without resistance. He did not fight. He did not beg. He already knew how futile both would be. And as he walked onward toward his fate, he began accepting the certainty of death with the quiet resolve of a dragon who had already given everything he had left to give. He was going to die. There were no 2 ways about it. But at the very least, he intended to meet the end with a defiant smile carved into his face until the final moment. A smile that would tell his people that he was with them till the end. Chapter 888. Please, boy. A few hours later, the pit, Ver's POV. The unique air of the pit hit Ver the moment they arrived, thick and oppressive, carrying the stench of iron, sweat, scorched stone, and old blood that had soaked so deeply into the ground it felt permanent. Rattle, rattle. The chains around his wrists tightened and dragged him forward like a tethered animal being led to slaughter, as Raymond walked ahead of him casually, one hand holding the chain loosely as though leading a walking dog, his posture relaxed and unbothered while his boots echoed rhythmically against the blackened stone pathway. Scrape, thud. Ver stumbled once before steadying himself, his bare feet scraping painfully against the rough ground as he was hauled forward past rows of towering barbarians lining the passageway, their massive frames wrapped in scarred armor and bone trinkets, crude weapons resting against their shoulders while eyes filled with raw violence tracked his every step. Grr. Hiss. Low snarls rippled through the ranks. Hisses followed. Teeth bared. Their expressions twisted with hatred as they recognized what he was. The cult dragon, a symbol, a prize meant to die for their entertainment, as waves of killing intent rolled toward him thick enough to taste. Come fight me if you dare. I'll kill you right here. A barbarian challenged, as Ver simply smiled in response. It was not a brave smile, nor a proud one. It was thin, tired, and laced with quiet contempt, as if intimidation at this level no longer even registered to him anymore. Stop smiling, weakling, or I'll bash your teeth in. One of the barbarians snapped, stepping half a pace forward as his knuckles whitened around the handle of his axe, veins bulging along his neck as rage spilled freely from him. Ver's eyelids lowered slightly as he turned his head toward the man, his gaze drifting over him without urgency or concern, as though he were looking at something already dead. Oh yeah, I'm a dead man anyway. You think I care about a few broken teeth anymore? Ver replied calmly, his voice dull with exhaustion rather than fear, as the words landed with unexpected weight causing the barbarian to freeze. His anger faltered mid-breath as confusion crept across his face, the simple fury that fueled him moments ago finding no place to settle, as his limited reasoning struggled to reconcile the lack of resistance. He glanced sideways at his fellow clansmen, then back at Ver, uncertainty dulling his eyes. This one has no fire in him. He's pitiful. The barbarian muttered, stepping back into line as his interest evaporated. HMPFH. Raymond snorted softly and tugged the chain again, dragging Ver forward as they approached a reinforced holding cell carved directly into the stone wall, thick bars etched with fresh containment runes. That still shimmered faintly, as he pushed Ver towards it. CREEK. The holding cell's door groaned open, as Raymond shoved Ver inside without ceremony, the chains rattling loudly as he staggered forward before catching himself, boots scraping against stone as he lifted his head. And then he felt it. A presence. Heavy. Oppressive. Wrong. His gaze rose slowly, dread coiling instinctively in his chest as his eyes locked onto the figure already waiting inside the cell. Morris sat on a stone bench with one leg crossed over the other, his posture relaxed to the point of mockery, as his long hair floated upward unnaturally, drifting as if gravity itself had chosen not to apply to him, his eyes sharp, calculating, and faintly amused all at once, like a predator already bored of its prey. Well, well, well. If it isn't the Oathbreaker's son. Morris said smoothly, his voice deliberate and controlled, as his gaze never once acknowledged Ver, and was instead pinned squarely on Raymond, as Raymond stiffened instantly. L1 Lord Morris. Raymond stuttered, his throat tightening as his shoulders drew back. Involuntarily, sweat forming along his temples as the weight of Morris's attention settled onto him like a vice. Ver, meanwhile, felt something colder than fear slide down his spine, not panic but something worse, something that came from recognizing a presence so far beyond him that even resistance felt meaningless. His instinct screamed in warning as his breath hitched slightly, unable to even begin comprehending the scale of power radiating from the man seated before him. Another god. And unlike Raymond, this one felt layered, deliberate, and infinitely more dangerous. Clang. The cell door slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang, metal reverberating through the stone as the sound echoed far longer than it should have. Ver did not turn around. He kept his eyes on Morris, jaw tightening as the reality of where he stood finally settled in. How have you been, my lord? It's an honor to see you again. Raymond said, as Morris grinned ear to ear listening to his fear. Oh Raymond, I've been simply brilliant ever since you attacked the cult and killed Charles. I must say, it was a turning point in the history of this universe. Because since then I'm just having so much fun all the freaking time. So I must thank you, my boy. I must thank you for encouraging your father to break the holy oath between us, and allowing you to become demigod. For without it, I would never be so entertained. Morris said, as sweat beads began to stream freely down Raymond's forehead now. The predatory look in Morris's eyes scaring him more than his father's anger ever had. No, my lord, you've got it all wrong. My father never allowed me to become demigod, I just deceived him. He would never knowingly break a holy oath between you gods. Raymond defended, as Morris instantly scoffed in response. Oh please. Don't talk about deceiving anyone before me, boy. I've been deceiving gods since before you were in your father's ball sack. So save the drama for someone else. Morris said as he stood up and gave Raymond a spank on his bum as if he were a naughty little child and nothing more, before walking out of the prison cell like Ver wasn't in it at all. The deceiver never even acknowledged the dragon, as if he did not even care for him at all. As it was only now that Ver realized that even though he was the one being executed soon, he was no more than bait meant to lure in the big fish. The execution was never about him. And it wasn't him that the gods were really after. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.